For the second half, we're leaving writing and going more into what writing has become, which is books. By speech first, but far more by writing, man has been able to put something of himself beyond death. In tradition and in books, an integral part of the individual persists, for it can influence the minds and actions of other people in different places and different times. A row of black marks on a page can move a man to tears. Through the bones of him that wrote it are crumbled to dust. That's one of my favorite quotes. You look at we've seen writing become what we use today, but we haven't seen it become books and paper. We've seen it become papyrus, we've seen it become scrolls, but not books. Chinese block writing can claim to be the first book. It originated around 220 in the Han Dynasty. And these were whole pages carved into wooden relief. These weren't painted by hand at all. These were exceptionally gifted artists would make wood reliefs backwards by hand. And then they would cover that with ink, and then they would put the paper over it. And that's an exceptional thing to do. The men that were able to do this were among the most revered in their society. And the oldest whole book made using this method is the Diamond Sutra, which you see right here. The Diamond Sutra. It begins with the words, "Thus have I heard," which reminded me a little bit of Once Upon a Time, like the first part of this discussion. And the Diamond Sutra is stories about monks that are going out into the community and begging for their food because monks aren't allowed to have any possessions or wealth. And then they come back and listen to the teaching of the sutra, and that's the story of the Diamond Sutra. It takes 55 minutes to read, and it's still read because it's still a currently held belief. But the Diamond Sutra is loosely known as a book, because as you can see, these are separate pages that have been bound together, all made through that Chinese block carving that is incredible. In the Dark Ages, writing took a little bit of a 2 steps back, 5 steps. 2 steps forward, 5 steps backward. After the fall of Rome, it was all vellum and parchment. Papyrus, out the window except for if you were in Egypt. Monasteries were the only people that really kept writing alive during the Dark Ages. And usually the clergy were the only people literate in the society. When you see stories and movies about, hear ye, the king decrees, the king never decreed anything written. And that guy is one of the very few people that was literate and able to read. It was just the clergy and occasionally the town crier of sorts. It was all expensive because all writing was copied by hand still at this point. Even though the Chinese were doing the block writing, the monasteries in Europe were doing everything by hand. So it was extremely expensive and rare. And what's really fun is it wasn't until the 7th century that there were spaces between words. Before that, all the letters just ran together and you just read it in this giant clump. And it was invented by Scottish monks because they weren't as familiar with Latin and they needed more time to understand the words, so they put the spaces in between them. Spaces didn't really become commonplace, though, until the 12th century. So you look at all of these ancient texts, no spaces, no punctuation. Books were chained to various different platforms at this time because they were so expensive and rare that if you stole a book, that was nearly a capital offense. It wasn't until the 13th century with the rise of universities that the demand for books really rose. Before then, people were pastoral farmers, they were just living their lives, they really didn't need to be literate. But with the rise of universities and the rise of the Renaissance and the learned classes, scribe guilds came into existence. And scribe guilds are a bunch of very learned people, non-affiliated with the church. This is when writing began to secularize, because they needed those scribes to copy these books, because the universities needed all of this literature, they needed the science, they needed the math, they needed more than just the Bible to do all of their studies. So it was a secular organization. And once the scribe guilds came, obviously they did protect the language a little bit in terms of not wanting to outsource the learning of how to read and write, but it was through these scribe guilds that writing really was able to disseminate into the general population. And while Europe was in its dark ages, Islamic manuscripts were incredibly beautiful. The Islamic world learned paper making from the Chinese in the 8th century, so they weren't using parchment or vellum, so they were using lightweight paper that was much more durable. They made books lighter and sturdier because of the environmental conditions in the Islamic world. Paper just made perfectly, and it didn't break, it didn't tear, and the pages lasted longer, so they invested more into it because they knew they would get more out of it. It was made of paper, just wood pulp. It would be the same kind of paper that we use today, though it would look like natural paper, like for scrapbooking. One really cool thing that the Islamic world did was that they used their copy method, which was check reading. And when you look at how the Dark Ages used it, they would have, in the monastery, one guy looking at one book, looking, okay, what does that say? And then writing over here, what does that say? Writing over here. That was the Dark Ages European method. The Islamic method was check reading. Copies were made to many scribes. There would be between like 12 and 15 people in one room, and the author would be there, and he would read the book to them, and they would all be copying at the exact same time. They could only do it if the author was present. Sometimes he wasn't the one speaking, but he was always present, and that way they could make so many more copies at the exact same time. So there were copies flourished in the Islamic world. And it pretty much stayed the course until the magic of printing came to be. Now, we all know Johannes Gutenberg, the Gutenberg press, not the first inventor of the printing press. Pai Sheng invented movable type letters in 1045 in China, but it never really caught on. And then Korea had movable type letters in 1230, but because there's so many different Chinese characters, that was never popular either. So Johannes Gutenberg in 1450 gets all the credit for it. And understandably so, he didn't have any knowledge of it. It was a separate invention, all of his own doing. But he wasn't the first. But the printing press was basically that same Chinese woodcut method, only they tended to use metal, and they made the individual letters, so they would put it on this giant platform and put each letter in its place, then roll the ink on, then roll the paper on. And they would force it down, and that's an actual replica of Gutenberg's, making a one-page printout, which were known as incunables, which is every single paper printout before 1501. I don't know why it's called an incunable, and 1501 is just this set date where afterwards they're printed pages, but before that, one-page things are called incunables. And the printing press was virtually unchanged up until the 20th century.
The thing they generally credit Gutenberg with, not so much the invention of moving type and all these other things, but the taking of all these different concepts and then bringing them together
Into the press machine.
Yeah, bringing this press, which was probably a modified grape press or a wine press, and bringing them all together and doing that. It wasn't so much a
Movable letters. He was the press maker. Yeah. And once again, I'm going to bring you back to South America, my love, for the Quipu. Now, that just looks like it's a bunch of braids. But in fact, this is how the Inca language was preserved, essentially. Writing isn't the only way to store knowledge. In Peru specifically, the Quipu was used as a quasi-decimal system for numerics. But what's really cool about the Quipu is it wasn't just numerics. In these strands, there are different colors and the different knots, and that means those have been postulated to mean different counting of animals, counting of people. These were used to take censuses, and the people that made these were called Quipu Kamayoks, and they could read these with their eyes closed. And it's just these long strands, and the biggest one that we have found was 2,000 different strands. And what's really cool about the Inca is the ruling class all knew how to read these. It wasn't just the scribes that knew how to do this and the Quipu Kamayoks. This was the entire ruling class. And you would bring them along in your pocket and it would transfer information. And I'm sure you've all heard of the Inca roads. They would bring these along the roads, and that's how they transferred all of their information. Now, when the conquistadors came, they realized, oh boy, they have some sort of writing system. I can't decipher that, so they destroyed every single one they could get their hands on. We only have 600 of them left. Yeah.
Well, and what was the story? Was it the Aztec, the
Inca.
The Inca, they did have the books though?
They had no books.
Yeah, but I'm trying to think there was in in Mexico that they had gone through